There's a number sitting on your retirement spreadsheet right now, and there's a good chance it's lying to you. It's the number that says you can't stop working yet. The one that keeps you at a desk for another 5, 8, 10 years, telling yourself you're being responsible. And the cruel part is, that number was never designed to be a target. It was designed to be a worst-case fire drill. You've been treating this smoke alarm like the house is actually burning down every single day for years. Here's what almost nobody tells you. The famous rule that sets that number, the 4% rule, was built to survive the single worst stretch of market in American history. And when researchers went back and checked what actually happened to people who used it, they found something wild. The overwhelming majority of them didn't run out of money. They died with way more than they started with. They spent their whole lives overpaying for a disaster that, for almost everyone, never came. By the end of this video, I'm going to show you why the real number you need to walk away at 55 is probably a lot smaller than the one scaring you. Why your investment account was never supposed to carry the whole load by itself, and why the decade you're about to trade for a bigger cushion might be the most expensive trade you ever make. Stick with me. I'm Mike. I'm a regular person who clawed his way to financial freedom on an ordinary income, mostly by figuring out the money stuff school never bothered to teach any of us. That's what this whole channel is about. The real math of money, the handful of things that actually move the needle for a normal person. Today, I'm making the case for walking away at 55 and showing you why the math is far more forgiving than the industry lets on. If that sounds useful, hit subscribe and stay with me. Let's start with where that scary number comes from, because once you understand it, you can't unsee it. The 4% rule says you can pull 4% of your investments out in your first year of retirement. Bump it up with inflation each year after, and your money should last about 30 years. Flip that around, and it's the same as saying you need 25 times your annual spending saved up. Spend $50,000 a year. The rule says you need $1.25 million. That's the one most people think they have to hit before they're allowed to stop. But here's the piece that changes everything. That rule wasn't built for an average outcome. It was built for the apocalypse. It was specifically designed to survive the worst possible time in history, to retire. Somebody walked out of their job right before the markets fell apart and stayed terrible for years. The whole point of the rule is to keep that unluckiest person on earth from going broke. So what happens to everybody else? This is where it gets good. A financial researcher named Michael Kitces went back through every 30-year retirement window in modern history and tracked what actually happened to people who followed the 4% rule. The results are almost funny. In about 96% of those cases, the retiree finished the 30 years with more money than they started with. Not less, more. Over 2/3 of the time, they ended up with more than double what they began with. And a typical retiree finished with close to 3 times their starting nest egg, still sitting there, untouched. In fact, 1 in 6 of them ended with more than 5 times what they retired on. These are not people who cut it close. These are people who were so terrified of running out that they spent their entire retirement underspending, leaving a fortune on the table. That could have been trips, time, and memories back when they were still young enough to use them. Let that land. The average person following this rule doesn't scrape by and barely survive. They die rich, often richer than the day they retired. The number of times in modern history the 4% rule actually got someone into real trouble, you can count on one hand. It was people who retired right into the crash of 1929, the late 30s, and the mid-60s. That's basically it. Those handful of nightmares are the entire reason the number is set so low. So think about what that means for you. The wall you've been told you have to climb before you can retire is built for a catastrophe that, the overwhelming majority of the time, simply does not happen. You've been saving for the unluckiest retiree in a century, and you are almost certainly not him. The 4% rule was never a target. It's a floor built for a worst case. And every extra year you grind away to pad a number that's already wildly cautious is a year you're handing to your heirs instead of yourself without even meaning to. Now, I told you I'd be straight with you, so here's the honest footnote. And it connects to something I've said before on this channel. If you're retiring at 55, your money might need to last not 30 years, but closer to 45 or 50, and over a longer stretch. There's more room for a bad start to do damage, so the cautious move is to shade your number down a little, to more like 3.5% instead of 4. That's the same as aiming for around 30 times your spending instead of 25. A bit more to save for a sturdier plan over a long life. But here's the thing. Even at that more careful 3.5%, built for a long early retirement, Kitces found the same lopsided story. The median early retiree still ends up with many times what they started with. So I'm not telling you to cut your safety margin. Keep it. I'm telling you that even with a healthy safety margin baked in, the wall is sitting much further behind you than you think. You've probably passed more of it than you realize. Okay, that's the first half of the trap. Here's the second half, and honestly, it's the bigger one. The 4% math makes one giant hidden assumption. It assumes your investment account has to pay for 100% of your spending entirely on its own for the whole rest of your life, as if your portfolio is a single exhausted workhorse pulling the entire wagon up the hill alone forever. But that's not how a real retirement at 55 works. Your portfolio has help coming, and that help dramatically shrinks the pile you actually need. There are 3 levers here, and once you see them, the number gets a lot friendlier. The first lever is Social Security. It doesn't show up at 55, but it's coming. For most people, it starts somewhere between 62 and 67, and it's a real check. Often around $2,000 a month, that keeps coming for life and rises with inflation. So your portfolio doesn't have to fund your full spending forever. It mostly has to cover the bridge, the years between 55 and when Social Security kicks in. After that, a big chunk of your income gets handed off to the government program you already paid into for decades. The second lever is your house. If you can get into retirement with the mortgage gone, you've knocked out what is, for most families, their single biggest monthly expense. And remember how the math works. Every dollar you cut from your spending doesn't just save you that dollar. It shrinks your finish line by 25 or 30 times that amount. Killing a $1,500 mortgage payment isn't worth $1,500. In retirement math, it's worth around $500,000 off your target. The third lever is a little bit of income on your own terms, and this is the one most people dismiss too fast. Retiring at 55 does not have to mean you never earn another dollar. Most people who retire that early are healthy and restless, and they end up doing something anyway. Some consulting 2 days a week, a small business, turning a hobby into a trickle of money. The point isn't to keep grinding. The point is that even a modest income in those early years means you barely have to touch your portfolio, which lets it sit there and keep compounding instead of shrinking, and is a quiet bonus to that part-time income that has nothing to do with money. A lot of people who fully slam on the brakes get blindsided by how much they miss having somewhere to be and something they're good at, easing out instead, doing a bit of work you actually chose. Hands you structure and purpose while you figure out what this next chapter even looks like. So the third lever doesn't only protect your portfolio. It protects you from the strange flatness that catches a lot of early retirees off guard in that first year. Let me put those 3 levers together because this is where retiring at 55 stops being a fantasy and starts being arithmetic. Picture someone who figures they need $50,000 a year to live. The full load rule says they need somewhere between $1.25 and $1.5 million before they can even think about stopping. That number feels impossible at 55, so they keep working. Now let's pull the levers. They finish paying off their house, and their real spending drops to $38,000 a year. They pick up a part-time consulting gig they actually enjoy, 2 days a week, bringing in $20,000 a year for the first several years. So now, in those early bridge years, their investments only have to cover the gap, which is about $18,000 a year. That's a completely different planet from $50,000. And because they're barely drawing on it, their portfolio keeps growing in the background. $500,000. Left mostly alone, growing at a modest 6% a year, becomes nearly $900,000 in about 10 years. So, while they're out living their life and doing a little work they like, the nest egg is quietly almost doubling. Then, right around the time the consulting winds down and they're ready to fully rest. Social Security switches on and covers most of what's left. The enormous pile they thought they needed at 55 was never actually required. They needed enough to cover a small bridge, not a 40-year solo marathon. That is the difference between thinking your portfolio has to do everything and understanding it just has to do its part. Now, a practical question always comes up right here, and it's a good one. Most of your money is probably locked in a 401k, and everybody knows you get hit with a penalty if you touch that before 59 and a half. So how does anyone retire at 55? There's a clean, legal answer most people have never heard of, called the Rule of 55. If you leave your job in or after the calendar year you turn 55, the government waives that 10% early withdrawal penalty on the 401k from that specific employer. You still owe normal income tax on what you pull out, but the punishing penalty disappears. There's one big trap to know about. It only works on money left in that workplace plan. If you roll it into an IRA first, which a lot of well-meaning people do, you lose the privilege entirely. So if early retirement is the plan, you leave that money right where it is. I'll do a full breakdown of this and the other early access tricks in another video because it deserves its own deep dive. There's one more real obstacle I won't pretend away because it's the one that actually stops a lot of people. Health insurance. If you retire at 55, you've got a 10-year gap before Medicare kicks in at 65, and you have to cover it yourself. For most early retirees, that means buying a plan through the government marketplace, and I'll be straight with you. It got more expensive this year. A temporary boost to the subsidies that have been in place since 2021 expired at the end of 2025, and premiums jumped for a lot of people in 2026. But here's the part that still works in your favor. There's a regular income-based subsidy underneath that, and it's tied to your taxable income. An early retiree who's living partly off savings in a paid-off house can often keep their taxable income low enough to still qualify for real help on the premiums. This stuff is politically up in the air right now, so check exactly what's current the year you actually pull the trigger. The headline, though, is this. The health insurance gap is a genuine hurdle, and it's also a solvable one, as long as you plan for it on purpose instead of letting it blindside you. So the money case for 55 is strong. But there's a second half to this decision, and it's the half that actually matters more, because no spreadsheet can fix it if you get it wrong. Ask people who retired late what they'd change, and almost none of them say they wish they'd worked longer. What they say is they wish they'd had more good, strong years on the other side. And there's a reason those strong years are more limited than we like to think. We tend to picture aging as a slow, gentle slope you ease down over decades. But a Stanford study published in the journal Nature Aging in 2024 found that's not really how it works. The researchers tracked thousands of molecules in people's bodies over time, and instead of a smooth decline, they found aging seems to come in sudden waves. One big shift lands in the mid-40s, and another lands right around the early 60s, with changes tied to things like heart health and the immune system. Now, I want to be honest, it's one study with a fairly small group of people, so don't treat it as gospel. But it lines up almost perfectly with what retirees describe, which is that the body seems to change gears right around 60. So sit with the timing of that. If you're 55 and your plan is to work hard until 65 and then finally start living, you are planning to begin your adventure right as your body is hitting that second wave. You'll be spending your last decade of reliably strong years at a desk, in order to pad a safety cushion that the math says you'll very likely never even need. That is the single worst trade in this entire plan. You're paying with the one thing you can't earn more of, to buy more of the one thing you already have plenty of. So let's put the whole thing together. The 4% rule is a worst-case floor, not a target, and most people who hit it die with far more than they started. Even with a careful safety margin for a long retirement, the wall is further behind you than you think. Your portfolio was never meant to carry the load alone, because Social Security, a paid-off house, and a little income on your terms can shrink the pile you actually need at 55 down to a bridge instead of a marathon. And the decade you'd spend padding that pile is the exact decade your body can least afford to lose. I want to be fair because I promised I would. This is not magic, and it's not for everyone. If you're 55 with very little saved and no paid-off house, the honest answer is that you got more work to do, and pretending otherwise would be doing you a disservice. The levers are what make 55 real. They are not wishful thinking, but you do have to actually have them in place. Here's your one action. Stop measuring yourself against that full load wall, the one that assumes your portfolio funds everything forever. Sit down and run your real number instead. Take your spending. Subtract what a paid-off house and a little part-time income and eventual Social Security will cover, and only then look at what your investments actually have to do. I think a lot of you are going to find you're standing much closer to that finish line than the scary number ever let you believe. If this changed the math in your head, hit subscribe, because the next one goes straight at the question I just teased. How to actually pull money out of your retirement accounts before the normal age without handing the government a penalty. The rule of 55 and a couple of other legal moves, laid out step by step. Take good care of yourself, and I'll talk to you soon.